Okay, so welcome everyone. So for the last Cardamom Seminar before the break, we're going to present a little bit about what's going on in our projects. So we talk about the Workbench, which is a tool that we've been creating to support digital humanities scholars in working with corpora. And Adrian Doyle will lead this. So Adrian, please go ahead when you're ready.
Right, thanks very much. I suppose I'll start by sharing my screen with you. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. We'll get back to that in just a little minute, but for now, I better start on the bit of a presentation I should give you first. So firstly, thanks everybody for coming to the talk. It's a talk on a workbench that we've been developing for most of the current year. And it represents the culmination of a lot of work on various technologies that we've been developing throughout the lifespan of the Cardamom project. The project itself and its team members and everybody else that's been involved in it aren't necessarily involved in the workbench itself, but certainly a lot of work has gone into this. So if I miss out on mentioning anybody, please do forgive me. But we'll go through the project itself first, because I think the project gives a good basis for why we've worked on this workbench. Obviously, John McRae is our principal investigator on the Cardamom project. We have our two postdoctoral researchers, Theodoros and Baretti. The team that deserve a huge amount of credit for putting together what I'm about to present to you today are Bernardo and our two interns in the Cardamom project, Elita and Kevlin. They are really the glue and nuts and bolts that holds together the Cardamom workbench. And I really couldn't honestly tell you in strong enough terms the amount of work that they've had to put in the last, particularly in the last week. Aside from that, of course, there are a number of us PhD candidates, and while we're involved in the Cardamom project to varying degrees, the research that we do and the technologies that we develop are all relevant to the Cardamom project. And so a lot of the technologies that we've been developing and pushing have made their way into the workbench. So what is the focus of the Cardamom project? I suppose is a good place to start. The focus is to assess and improve the state of technology for historical languages and minority languages. Now, I know a lot of work is constantly done on improving the state of affairs for minority languages, as they tend to be the lesser resourced languages. But it is worth mentioning, and it is a big focus of the Cardamom project, that historical languages, in fact, have a lot of similarities with minority languages. In a lot of cases, you find that they're equally, if not more so, morphologically rich, but also that they don't tend to get as much attention. And so they can also be very, very under-resourced by comparison to better resourced modern languages. The aim of the project, of course, is to close the resource gap, to make the technologies that are available for the better resource languages available to the minority languages and to the historical languages, so that people can expect to use their own, whichever language they intend to or prefer to use, or that they work with, or whatever dialect that may be, and that it should be as seamless as using English or German or a better resource language. Now, this in and of itself, of course, isn't necessarily particularly outside the box, because work has been done in this area before. But the means by which the Cardamom project aims to work is specifically using deep learning based approaches. So we do a lot of work with neural networks, word embeddings, and so on and so forth. I'm not entirely sure what the makeup of the audience today is, but assuming that we have a mix of linguists and computer scientists. So I don't intend to spend too much time bogged down in any one area, but I think it's necessary to give a quick overview of the kind of things I mean when I talk about the resource gap, neural networks, and word embeddings, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about the resource gap, John did present on this about a year ago when talking about the Cardamom project at an earlier seminar in the series. We look at well-resourced languages like German, and we find that there are hundreds of millions of words available. So there's a lot of data that can be used to train models, and that's a big issue when it comes to neural models. And indeed deep learning is the more data you have, the better you can expect them to be generally. Languages like Hindi, which perhaps are less of a minority language, that it's certainly very widely spoken, but it's not as well resourced as something like German, having only about 13 million words as of the time we checked this. And then you look at languages like Irish and Scottish Gaelic, which are both minority languages and under-resourced. Of course, there have been as regards creating resources for Irish by the likes of Eleni Gunnaha, Teresa Lynn, Kevin Scannell, and the list goes on. So Irish does have several million word corpus available as training data by comparison to Scottish Gaelic, which had under 1 million words available to researchers as of the time of checking this. Finally, when you look at historical languages like Old Irish, you find that they're in a particular position in that not only is there very little data available, but because they're no longer productive languages, there's never really going to be more data made available. And so this brings us onto a kind of a two-pronged approach when it comes to creating language resources and making language technology available for lesser resource languages. A lot of focus has been on what's been called dark data, maybe language that exists on the web, but it might be messy. There might be a lot of code switching. It might not be ideal data for using in training of models, but it's at least theoretically possible that there's quite a lot of language out there that's untapped and can be used. But when it comes to this, you know, going online and taking text from forums and from Twitter and social media, you run into problems very quickly outside of just is it clean data. There's questions to be asked about licensing. You know, is it all right to use data that somebody has put on a platform without the intention being that it would be used for training models and such? Nevertheless, a lot of effort has been put on increasing the availability of resources like text in languages like Irish, Scottish Gaelic, to bring them up to this language technology threshold, whereby we might expect that models for those languages will work as well as in languages like Hindi, German, English, and better resource languages. But as I said, in languages like Old Irish and other historical languages, there's never going to be more of that language created. And there certainly won't be, at least in significant quantities, to get it up to this threshold. So a lot of the focus of the Cardamom project has been on creating technologies and adapting technologies to bring that threshold down closer to the level that that we have resources for in those languages. So we might not be able to close that gap entirely, but it's a kind of a two-pronged approach to making the technologies more available and accessible. So again, I mentioned that the focus of the project is on deep models. So for the linguists that are watching this, who maybe aren't familiar with what I mean by deep models, I'm just going to quickly go through how they work, because they're often presented as a bit of a black box, and they seem kind of impenetrable. And I think where that thought frame exists about a technology, there's always a bit of doubt about whether it can be used. So they're very simple in how they work theoretically. Say you have a task that you want to complete. You have a lot of pictures of different types of animals, and you want to decide, you want to create a model to tell you this is this type of animal or that type of animal. What you do is create an architecture that looks something like this. Usually when it's depicted, you have an input layer where you feed in information, and you have an output layer that makes a decision. So one of those two nodes at the end will light up, and that's representative of whether the system thinks that the word you've inputted is related to the bottom picture or the top picture. So before a model like this is trained, and as I mentioned, you do need to feed it a lot of data to get it trained. You have to, before it's trained, it'll make guesses at random. So if you put in a word like donkey, you might expect that it will pick the donkey picture on the top. What happens in the model is that the nodes, the little circles there, they will perform a calculation. It might be a sigmoid function or ReLU, but essentially if each one of these nodes performs the calculation and the output is significant, it will fire on to the following layer of neurons to which it's connected. And so there'll be a cascade through the system of various calculations until such time as it gets to the end and a decision is made. In this case, it's made the wrong decision. So what you do is you tell the system, go back, and what I want you to do is the connections between those nodes, the paths that you went through, all of those paths that led you to making the wrong answer, system, I want you to weaken those. Try again. This time we feed in the word monkey. Same cascading effect, and it makes the correct answer. And in this situation, you tell it, great, all of the connections that you went through to get that correct answer, I want you to strengthen them. And what eventually happens is that the connections that are making poor judgments are weakened to the point that they tend not to be used very much. And the connections that are shown to make very good guesses as to which animal is which are strengthened. So you end up with very strong neural paths through the system, such that when you feed a word into it, like donkey, it has a much straighter path and only the most relevant neurons fire. So this is the basis of a lot of the technologies that we've been working with, but we've applied it to various different tasks, and I'll go through a few of those tasks in just a minute. Another thing that we've worked on is, of course, using word embedding models. Word embedding models are based on the notion that language is used in a particular way, that certain words will occur at certain rates, and it might happen across different languages, and it might happen differently with different people writing the text. But by and large, you can make calculations based on the frequency with which different words are used together. So if you take examples like these sentences here in two different languages, I've color coded them just for the sake of the demonstration, but it goes without saying, the model itself doesn't see the information that's color coded here. It just sees the collections of words. And what the model will do is it will see that words like is and a are used quite frequently together. Or in Irish, you might get is and another word A, and you can make calculations based on the frequency with which these pairs of words are used together. So they're at this point projected into multidimensional vector space, and they make up points in this vector space. I've presented it here in a kind of a 3D vector space, but of course it's multi-dimensional. But what happens at this point is you use a clustering algorithm, and it will draw words that are used with similar frequencies together in the vector space. And hopefully they'll form fairly clean clusters. Now, what this can be used for is a number of different things. So we had 2 languages there. And what you'll find is if all of those green things, which were all nouns, are pulled together, you find that you might be able to use word embeddings to aid in machine translation, for example. If 2 words are very, very close in a particular dimension in this vector space, you might be able to say, well, in this case, we can assume that this word is a translation of that word. Similarly, words like the copula and the English word is are likely to be pulled together because they're used in similar ways across languages. Even within the same languages, words like determiners, this and that, she and shin, or shot and shin in Irish, will be pulled into a similar area. So you can make determinations about what types of words they might be. So it can be used for morphological analysis as well. And this takes us on to the types of tasks that we have applied these technologies to in Cardamom. So myself, I've done a lot of work over the last few years on tokenization, splitting texts into their component words, and part of speech tagging, identifying what types of words they are, verbs or nouns or whatever the case may be. This is a task that is, it's kind of deceptively difficult, because when we consider modern European languages and their orthographies, we can usually say, well, you split them based on where the spaces and the punctuation are. And quite often that generalization doesn't hold for languages like Southeast Asian languages, languages like Vietnamese, and indeed for historical languages like in Latin, where you get continuous script before word spacing was introduced. We've also applied it to language identification tasks. This is something that Priya and Kustava have worked on. Kustava has worked on identifying perhaps the primary language of a text with multiple tokens, while Priya has worked on identifying the language of individual tokens. What this allows us to do is automatically find instances of code switching. It allows us to make determinations maybe about whether a particular writer was more comfortable with one language or another when they were writing a particular text. We've also applied these techniques to morphological analysis tasks. This is something that I know Kustava has worked on, and it's an area of interest for Theodoros Franson as well. So if you talk about rule-based systems for morphological analysis, you run into difficulty quite quickly. So where in languages where there are exceptions, even in English, verbs like to go, if you have a word in a text like going, and you want to know what the citation form in a dictionary is, and you have a rule-based system, it might say, well, you just get rid of the ing suffix and that's your dictionary form. The problem is where there's an exception, like in this case, there's a suppletive past tense form for the verb to go. You say, I went. And if you are just applying a rule-based approach, that means that it would likely give you a word like goad, G-O-E-D, as the suggestion for what the past tense would be. So in older rule-based approaches, you need to write a huge number of exceptions to the rules that you've already written based on individual examples. What's very powerful about the neural approaches that the likes of Kustova on our team has applied here is that if you feed enough data into the system, it will be able to learn without ever being told the past tense of the verb go is went. It will just determine it on its own without ever having to be told it outright. We've also applied these techniques to cognate detection. This is something that myself, Kustova, and Oksana have all worked on over the last couple of years. And Kustova has recently published on, I believe he managed to improve on what was at the time the state of the art using one of his own neural models. So this obviously, when we're dealing with a large number of languages and historical languages, it's very useful to be able to tell, well, this word in this language is either a cognate or a borrowing, or it's a derivative from a word in that language. And it's equally important to be able to say, well, these two words are maybe spelt orthographically very similarly, they're actually not related at all. And this further down the line allows us to leverage comparisons between languages without applying a kind of philological framework to them. We can just allow our models to determine that there's a connection and therefore strengthen our language models. Finally, I mentioned already telemetry, that word embeddings can be very good for example, telling apart authors. If you have 3 or 4 texts by an author and you want to know if a 4th or 5th text that's anonymous is by the same author, you can usually determine by calculating the extent to which different terms are used in the different texts. And if they cluster together, if the texts cluster together, it would suggest that they use different terms with about the same amount of frequency. And so maybe it's the same author. I've also mentioned that it's very good for the next task, which is machine translation. And this is something that I believe John and Atul have worked on as regards the Cardamom project. So these are all areas where we've made pushes in the Cardamom project. And at this point, you could nearly lay back on your laurels and say, well, congratulations, good work, team. John, write up the final IRC report. We've done our job here. But I don't think that's something that any of us would be particularly happy to do. For one thing, there's a sense in which any of us who are creating language technologies or who are pushing language technologies forward, we do it in the hope that they will be useful to somebody. We don't do it just to be able to say, I improved on the state of the art. But when we work on these, we often write perhaps Python scripts, or we code things and run them in Bash. And this isn't something that's going to be accessible to the majority of people in the humanities or even in the digital humanities without a significant amount of effort being put into learning how to use Python or how to run commands in Bash and so on and so forth. So this is where the idea of the Workbench comes into place. It's a kind of, it's an opportunity for us to create a graphical user interface which makes the technologies we've been working on available to a wide array of people who would otherwise not have access to them. And that brings me on to the next issue, the view from the humanities. Because while we might only see problems from a very particular perspective, we might say, oh, there's not enough text data in this particular language. I can't get very good results because I don't have enough data. The view from the humanities is usually quite different, and I can attest to this myself. For one thing, we often hear from humanities scholars Perhaps linguists working in a historical context will say, during the course of my research, I wanted to examine particular themes in a historical text. There was no digital version of it available, so I had to create that myself. Now that my research project is finished and I've done the research I wanted to as regards the themes I was finding in that text, I now have this digital text sitting on my computer, and I'd like to put it online, or I'd like to maybe make it available to others because people keep emailing me to see if they can get access to it. It would be great if I could put it somewhere that they could just get access to it. The difficulty is that where there is no outlet, a lot of researchers, particularly in linguistics and the humanities, their interest isn't in the technical aspects of getting it online. To a lot of people, and I certainly don't blame anybody after the week myself and Bernardo have had trying to get our own Workbench to behave itself for us. I don't blame anybody who doesn't want to get involved in that and who simply says, well, I'd just like to stick to my own research. So there is a certain amount of technical expertise necessary. Even when you talk about standards for the humanities, like text encoding initiative for encoding text data, there is a learning curve there, and certainly it can be as complicated as you want it to, but there is a lower threshold. There's a point at which, you know, you do have to jump in and learn some amount to get it to work at all. And certainly you might say, well, WordPress is available and there are other things that can be done. But again, some people simply don't want to have to deal with WordPress just to make what is a valuable contribution to academics available to those academics. And another concern at any rate tends to be that even if you put something on WordPress, or even if you perhaps have funding in your research project in the humanities to get something developed and put online, maybe you can employ a web developer to create a website to host this work for you. There's no guarantee that it will still be available in 5 or 10 or 20 years' time after the funding for the project has ended. And this is a big concern, because why would you spend that money or that time learning the technical aspects of getting this online if you don't know that the server that it's hosted on is still going to exist in 5 years, or if you don't know that a new version of HTML is about to come in that will render it inaccessible. So keeping things available once they've been put online is another big concern in the humanities. There's a certain desire to get things put online, get them available to everybody, and then there's people kind of want to just step back from it and say, there, I've put it there, it exists, it's out in the world. I would like it to not change at all, ideally, for the next 80, 90 years. And unfortunately, the way technology moves, that's just unrealistic at the moment. Aside from that, there's one more concern, which is that academics in the humanities may not want to make something available digitally online for very valid reasons, not least among which is that peer reviews tend to be focused on print editions, not digital editions. So this comes down to the viewpoint you take on it. From the computer science viewpoint, you might say, well, this is the power of web editions and online editions, is that they don't necessarily need to be peer reviewed as much, because in the time it would take for a peer review to happen and for it to be published, you could have fixed a problem on the website, and the thing that was reviewed is no longer an issue. The flip side of that, however, is that from the humanities viewpoint, peer reviews are actually good for your academic progress. It's your way of engaging with other academics, and also there's certain career aspects to it. And it's not unreasonable for somebody to want to publish something in print, specifically to have it peer reviewed, to have that engagement with other academics. And that has to be kept in mind. So on top of making the technologies that we've been talking about up to this point available, these are all areas that we think in the Cardamom project, we can add value to humanities users. So obviously we can, in the Insight Center, we have our own servers. We can give people an outlet to put their stuff online if that's where they want to publish it. And we have the technical expertise to make sure that these web servers stay live and everything on them remains there. And if anything were to happen, somebody could contact us and say, listen, I can't find this. Is it still online? And we might be able to fix it for them very quickly. So this alleviates the first three problems there. We'll be able to keep things available long-term at no cost to the end user from the humanities, and they will be able to get the value from having this corpus that would otherwise have sat around on a hard drive until a computer got recycled. By having it available to people who can cite it, people who can engage with them academically. And so the last hurdle really is only something that is still an aspiration of ours. If there is an interest in the Workbench and in publishing things through the Cardamom Workbench, I don't see any reason why we couldn't down the line have print editions come out of it as well. So here is how we see the Cardamom Workbench operating. Users are going to be able to sign up, create a user account. From that point on, they'll be able to add text files and edit them using the Workbench. And when I say edit, I don't mean necessarily as a word processor, though it will have that kind of functionality, certainly. I mean, they'll be able to provide things like translations for the text, which to us as regards training data is the equivalent of having parallel corpora in two languages. But where we have trained models already, we'll be able to use Cardamom technologies to aid them with that translation, and the user can simply oversee the translation and edit it as they see necessary. So that's why this is showing up in green. It's a task that a user can do that can be aided by Cardamom technologies. They can also annotate the text. And while this is primarily a user task, which is something that has to be carried out manually, hence it's in blue here, it's something that the Cardamom Workbench itself is able to make easier. So when you talk about tagging and annotating metadata, you often, there's this expectation that you're going in and copying and pasting or otherwise inserting actual tags in the text. And this really isn't something that's that a lot of people from the digital humanities necessarily want to do. So the Workbench is going to give them the ability to simply highlight a certain amount of text or click on different words and annotate them in a much more intuitive way. So metadata like perhaps manuscript abbreviations can be tagged where they've been expanded in the text, or spelling errors in an original text that have been corrected. All of this type of data can be encoded and stored in the Workbench so that when it's later published, be it online or elsewhere, we can insert, quite often these things are shown using italics or brackets, but we can show it in a number of ways and even make the text interactive, replacing all of the manuscript abbreviations with expansions and vice versa. So this is hopefully going to make for a more modern version of what we see and what we have seen in print editions for the past 100 years. Another form of annotation, of course, is the likes of tokenization, and following on from that, related tasks like POS tagging, morphological analysis, and various other Cardamom technologies that we've been talking about up to this point, like stylometric analysis. We'll allow all of this to happen on the Workbench. So if someone from the humanities decides, I want to upload 2 or 3 texts, and I want to do an analysis on them to see if they're by the same author, this is the type of thing that we'll be able to make available to users who would otherwise have to learn to use not only Python, but various different Python libraries and technologies to be able to implement themselves. Now, at this point, a user might be happy, they've done their research and the Cardamom Workbench has helped them, and if so, great. But as I've said, that's a very computer science way of looking at it. We can add more value to humanities scholars by allowing them to publish them online as well, as I've just mentioned. So the process for that will be that once a user is happy with a text that they have uploaded, that they've edited and annotated, they'll be able to submit that text for publication. At this point, the system itself will kick in. It will validate any annotation that's been done to the text, and if there's any outstanding errors, or perhaps a word has been annotated incorrectly or in an unusual way, this will be flagged to the user. The user can then decide to send it on anyway. And of course, if it passes validation, it'll just automatically be sent on, at which point a Cardamom administrator will be able to approve the publication and it can be immediately put online. So that's the online process. Obviously, there's going to be a few more steps if and when we start talking about print publications. But there's one final thing that is very worthy of mention here, which is that once a text has been deemed worthy of publication, that it's of a high enough standard in terms of its annotation that it can be published online with the rest of the Cardamom texts that go through this process, that text can now be fed back into the system. The lexicon for the language of that text can be updated. And that means that we can now improve the technologies and retrain models. And the next time that user or another user working with the same language comes back to the Cardamom Workbench, all of the tasks that they want to do will be made easier because of the contribution they themselves have made to improving those models. So at this point, time is moving on. I think it's very, very necessary for me to move on to giving an actual demonstration of the Workbench as it stands at the moment. So this is what we have at the point of login. Once you log in, you can upload your texts here using the file upload, or you can go to text that you're already working on. For example, we have an English text here. And as you can see, various different annotation tools empowered by Cardamom technologies are available. There's kind of a workflow. You can edit the text first. You then need to tokenize it if you want to be able to perform any sort of language identification or any further annotations. So you can automatically tokenize it. If you're not happy with the automatic tokenization, you can always go back and say, actually, I think that this should be a separate token, and you can automatically tokenize that. I think I have to select the language first, don't I? Right, and now you have made over and kingdom two separate words. Similarly, in languages like Irish, there's going to be different requirements for tokenization based on different languages. So the auto tokenizers are intended to tokenize each language independently using a model that is trained specifically for that language. And this is very important because when we start looking at different languages, I've already mentioned Vietnamese, but we have an example here from Latin. If you want to tokenize Latin script, you'll run into problems like this. In the earliest script, you get words separated by a kind of interpunct. But later on, Latin texts like this example from Cicero, things that we would consider to be individual words tend to be compounded. So we need to, and we have been working on tokenizers that will be able to split a text like this into tokens like this one on the bottom. Finally, I've mentioned where Cardamom technologies fall down because we don't have enough training data. So I'll give you an example from Old Irish. What we have happening here is something that we know in Old Irish should be probably one token. It's an abbreviation for id est. You get a full, essentially a full stop, the letter character I, and another full stop. And what most tokenizers will do is they'll decide, well, usually when I see a full stop at the end of following a letter, that's the end of the word. So I separate it from that word. So on the one hand, the tokenizer has gotten quite a bit right here, but we also need to do a bit more work. We need to be able to say, no, I want you to tokenize this as one single token. I want to be able to separate tokens like verbs from suffixes. And while this may look like I have to do quite a bit of work here at the start, the result is that I've now created a text and I've annotated it in such a way that the Cardamom Workbench can take the annotated text, bring it back to the backend and retrain its tokenization model for Old Irish so that when I want to annotate an Old Irish text again, and it sees these suffixes like sa and she, and even kind of compounded prefixes like, in this case, fri, it will be able to make a better determination that actually I should tokenize these as individual words in their own right. We can then go on to another task like, oh, I should have probably saved that. But just for argument's sake, we'll go on to another task like POS tagging. Assuming that I accept that all of these are tokens in Old Irish, or even in the English example, I can then go on to POS tagging it. I can say, well, loud is a proper noun, so it will tag it as a proper noun. The boin, again, proper noun. And you can go through this on a word-by-word basis, or you can automatically do it using the Cardamom technologies. And we'll have, when this is finally made available, we'll have the technology built in to automatically part-of-speech tag, perform other forms of annotation, even identify words in here that maybe I want to say Doyle and narde here are in fact Irish words in an otherwise English text. We'll be able to do that in the language selection tab. So this is the long and short of how the Cardamom Workbench is going to operate. And at this point, I'm going to pass it back over to anybody who's interested to comment maybe on what would make this a more useful tool for them in their own research, or what they believe that could be done to improve this. And of course, I'm happy to take any other questions that people might have. So thank you very much.
Hey, thanks. Are there any questions? Thanks, Jay. You want to ask a question?
Yes, please. May I? Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Can you actually see me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, thanks, Adrian. That's wonderful. And I missed the first 2 or 3 minutes. I'm sorry, but it seems like a very useful platform for people to collaborate. And I'm wondering maybe in the future if I could, you know, the TLH, the thesaurus, lingua hiberniae, we have all those HTML files, maybe somebody could incorporate them into the Cardamom platform to make them into proper, corpus material. My question is actually related to how do you actually change and save those? Like, how do you, what kind of a mechanism do you have on version control? Like, how do I know which version is which and done by which? Because proper attribution is very, very important for digital publications.
So when you talk about version control and proper attribution, do you mean how do we know who contributed?
Yeah, which version is it and who did it and how do we cite this?
Okay, so I suspect that the way that this will eventually work is that users have to sign into their own account to do this. If you've uploaded a text, you'll be able to say to another user, you'll be able to invite them to edit your text. I think that when it comes to something like a print edition or perhaps an online edition, there's no reason that we can't add to the text and say something like so and so was involved in this, another person was involved in that. But we'll also have a list of people that you've added built into the system, that you've added who have contributed in which ways, and we are already collecting data in the back end, so that it's kind of ironic. We collect the data so that if you and I are working on the same text, for example, and I make a change and you decide, oh, I don't like that change, I want to go back to the last version, you'll be able to roll back, and we in the system are able to say, well, this person made this change at this point in time, and this is what it affected. So there's two ways you can do it. You can do it the old-fashioned way, which is by deliberately and manually writing something into something that's going to be published and say, so and so took part in this project and this is what they did. But also we will have in our database the list of people who took part in editing this.
So it's like the wiki system where you can see the past editors and the what kind of changes they have done, and you can roll back the versions as well.
Yeah, well, it's certainly like that from the back end. We haven't made that kind of functionality available in the front end yet, but I mean, it's a very interesting thing to. I mean, do you believe that's something that would be very useful for front end users to be able to see?
Well, I guess. I'm not sure. I mean, we're still exploring that kind of ideas, because for digital humanities, since you mentioned that, for scholars working on those things, like a proper citation, who did what or how to cite it, what kind of a timestamp do we have on it, right? Because if you cite something and you publish it and later it's changed, how can we reconcile these kind of differences? Right. So it's all, I don't know, like we had this problem since we were working on for Cronhib. But later we decided for Cronhib, we just use some kind of a batch, like a version 1.00 batch or something. And then we don't reflect the changes in real time. So we only release a new version once there's this enough changes to it, right? So there might be a lot of ways how you can manage this, but I'm just wondering, like, do you have an idea how you want to do it?
Yeah, I think based on what I showed there, what will eventually happen is that, supposing you're the person who's responsible for the text, and there's 2 or 3 others, one or other of you is going to have the responsibility to submit that text for publication, and that's your batch. Then that's you saying, I want this to be published on the website. Now we can certainly roll it back based if you decide later, actually I'd like to roll it back to an earlier version, we'll have the data stored in the system itself to roll it back to that. But it's something we're going to have to work out how much of what's behind the curtain to show, because I think that the other side of it is that if you make the entire database structure or any amount of it available and present it to people and expect them to use it, that can be a bit overwhelming too if you just want to work on a text. So we could do it a number of ways. We could have kind of an advanced settings that different users can access if they like, or they can choose not to engage with it. But we certainly have the data stored, who made changes, when, what the changes amounted to. So if you publish something, you'll still be able to roll back changes in it and republish the new version. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Great question. Are there any other questions? Elena?
Yes, sure. First of all, I wanted to thank Adrian for this very nice presentation. While you were speaking, Adrian, there were several things that came to my mind out of interest, out of curiosity. One of them is, have you considered all this research on synthetic data for Old Irish? Is this something that you think could work? Because I know there is a lot of work in creating, right, artificial data in those cases in which you don't have enough data.
Yeah, I have, and I know that certainly I presented it there in a kind of in a way as if to say there'll never be more Old Irish produced. And while that's true in the sense that there'll never be a fluent speaker of Old Irish writing Old Irish again, there are certainly people like Professor Stifter annually translates a Joy Division song into Old Irish. So there is some amount of text constantly being created. I think the difficulty is twofold. Firstly, with Old Irish in particular, there is a big distinction between the type of text that you get in the manuscripts and hence diplomatic editions, and the type of text that academics tend to write. When you see someone like me writing an example in Old Irish, the orthography that I use is different. I'll use a kind of standardized version of spelling, whereas what you get in the manuscript, you often get a lot of words orthographically conjoined to one another, and you get essentially an orthography that requires very different tools to piece it apart. So there's certainly a big discussion to be had around synthetic Old Irish in general, but in a strange way, you'd almost have to treat it like an entirely separate language in and of itself.
I see. Wow, challenging.
Fun.
Okay, then I was also wondering about, you said that when you correct the different algorithms produce, the different annotations, the tokens, etc., you are forced, well, the system will learn, right, from those iterations. So how is it possible for you to influence and say, okay, now this text that has been corrected, has been checked, now is like more important or more relevant, these annotations are better than the ones you have produced? How do you achieve that?
So there's two things you can do. Obviously, anytime you train a model, you want to test it against a gold standard corpus. So where there's no gold standard corpus against which to test it, you do run into some difficulty. But if we already have a model and we add some text to our training data, and we find that the models trained on that newly collected data produce better results when we look at its application to the gold standard test set, then we'd probably be fairly happy to say, okay, well, this model is doing better now. It would be actually quite interesting to see if it did worse as well, because that might suggest that actually users are tokenizing words differently to one another, or they're using POS tags differently to one another. And in a way, so as not to be too heavy-handed with what users can do, we kind of suggest we're going using the POS tags in this system that are used in universal dependencies. corpora, because that means that, I mean, there's a few strengths to this. Firstly, because it's such a widely used standard, it means that that the output from our users using this workbench is likely to be useful to more people and more accessible, and probably it will have more longevity in and of itself, rather than if we used, say, a POS tag set that is proprietary or kind of specific to the language. So on the one hand, if we see a big decrease in performance, it might suggest that a user is breaking away from that. But I don't know if you can really, if you can say in any stronger terms, you have to use the tokenization standard or the POS tags that are used in this way, because of course the people that are going to be involved in doing this are intelligent people. They're academics themselves. They know what's required in the languages. So it's a very valuable question. How would you gauge this? I suppose if it passes the gold standard test, you can be fairly sure. If it doesn't, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but we probably need to have some sort of administrative oversight in that case.
Yeah, my question was more in the sense, when you are using these neural networks, these kind of models, it's difficult to understand how you are influencing the model, or if you are doing that at all, right?
Okay.
Or how many good examples you would need so that the next time the system tokenizes something, it does it in the new way or the right way. So
yeah, it is difficult to know that, and I certainly don't have an easy answer for you, other than that. I suppose similar to like what I said, if you see an improvement on the test set, then it probably is starting to do something a bit better.
Yes, and I was also curious about the annotation functionality, but probably this is something under construction.
Yeah, there's still a lot of things that we're trying to, the technologies are there, but we're trying to sort out in terms of the front end development.
Okay.
But I can certainly answer any questions you might have about it.
No, I was just curious to see if it's already working, but because I think that there are many claims or many annotation tools, but when you really want to use them for your own purposes, it's always difficult, right? So I think they are always very useful, and if it makes life of researchers easier, then they are more than welcome always. So I'll keep an eye on it.
Do please, and let me know if there's anything specific that you think would make it easier, because that's exactly the kind of question that I was hoping to elicit. Is has, in areas where something like this has been touched on before, what are the difficulties? What would I be missing if I was coding the front end and I said, oh, this is what I think somebody might need? What are the difficulties that they might run into that I would never in a million years consider unless it actually happened to them? And can we avoid that from the start?
I think one of the things we've run into is how if I'm annotating something, what do I get when I want to download the results? Is it something I can further work with? So we've been using some freely available online tools to produce annotations, such as Hypothesis, I think was one of it. And the problem was we weren't able to make anything useful later on with the results. Yeah.
Okay.
Probably because they were using proprietary or I don't know, not really a standard format, so that we could be used then afterwards. So you end up creating your own tool, and everyone is like creating their own tools.
Yeah, that is a danger, and certainly a lot of the reason that I pushed for us to do certain things on this is because I had already had to create my own tool to do something that I wanted to a couple of years ago with tokenizing the Würzburg glosses. So yeah, I certainly see where you're coming from there. In terms of downloading the data, that's not a functionality we've implemented yet, and it's something that we have to give some mind to, because we're storing all of our annotations in a relational database structure in the backend. So if we want to say, oh, this is the start point of code switching to Latin from Old Irish or something, what we'll have stored is a change made by a particular user at a particular index in a particular text, and it will then have it will then say what type of change that is. So they're marking this as Latin text from here onwards. So we need to have a think about how, if we're allowing users to then download this in some text format, maybe we have to work out how to put in TEI tags at those indices, which is admittedly, that's a bit down the road yet. What we're hoping to do is empower people to do a lot of the work that they would want to do on the Workbench itself. But I can see that there would be a desire for people to use the Workbench to annotate and then get the data back. And that is probably something we need to start looking at doing more seriously than we have been.
And I assume you can also then, if I want to annotate my data with respect to a certain ontology or terminology or thesaurus that is out there, that I'll be able to upload that for my annotations. Is that something you are considering?
See, that's dependent on a few things. Firstly, do you have the rights to upload that? So if you want to upload a text and it's yours, and you know you've created that text yourself, that's easy, you can do that. If you want to upload a text by somebody else, that's where you run into certain difficulties. So yeah, we're obviously going to have to take licensing into it, but how do you expect that you would want to involve, say, somebody's thesaurus?
I'm just thinking of I have created my own thesaurus or terminology or ontology.
Okay.
Or it's one I'm reusing that is open and available to be reused, and I want to use it to annotate my text. I don't know if that's a common use case. I was just
yeah, that's a good one. Again, because we're trying to stick to universal dependencies frameworks for the sake of universality. The lexicons that we use are going to be tied into what already exists in UD Corpora. But that's definitely an interesting area you could go into if somebody does have their own tools. It's something that hadn't crossed our minds.
Okay. Maybe this is something different. Okay, thanks so much, Adrian.
Thank you very much.
Okay, have any other questions? Good. If so, I'd like to thank Adrian, and I'd like to thank the whole Cardamom team. It's very hard work and a great presentation, and we're all going well, so thank you. And yeah, so we won't have a presentation in August because it's the summer, but we'll be back in September and we have a speaker lined up, which will be announced soon. So, thank you all and have a nice evening.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.